Hello, welcome back to Quilts Bloom at Dawn. We really and truly are at the final step of our trip around the island, and that is our binding. So in just a couple minutes, we'll get started with the process. But first, I wanted to mention that at the end of the video, in addition to taking a final look at our trip around the island, we're also going to look at the two Scrappy projects that we've been working on along the way. One is our Bluebird crossing quilt, and so I'll be looking at that one up close. The other Scrappy project that I've been working on in conjunction with the trip around the island and the Bluebird crossing has been the churn dash and the Irish chain. And again, that was made with just some leftover half square triangles, and from that it morphed into churn dashes and then eventually the chain block. And that quilt just turned out to grow, and by the end, when I measured it, it was actually a king size quilt, and I made a couple pillow shams to go with it. So we'll take a final look at that one today as well. So stay tuned to the end for a final look at all three projects. It's time for the last step in the process of our trip around the island, and that is the binding. Today we're going to be applying the binding. So we've completed, of course, all the basting, we've already done all of the quilting, and we even trimmed it up so it is ready to go, ready to be applied. So before we get started, I thought I'd just show you a few of the tools that I use for my binding process. I used to do binding by hand, but as many quilts as I make, honestly, I just don't have the time or the patience to do that. Well, hey, Henry, we have a visitor here. Hey there. Here's Henry. He just came for a visit. I just wanted y'all to see him. He's our big baby. He just turned 2. Yes, you did. So he came for a visit. Oh, and now baby's jealous. So here's baby 2. Y'all seen her before, but she gets jealous. If he gets love, she gets love. So there's baby. Okay. Yes. They want lots of love right now, apparently. So I'll be right back. Hey, we actually have one more dog, Toby. Not sure where he's at right now, but there's a lot of activity with 3 little critters running around here most of the time. So I'm surprised y'all don't hear or see them more than you probably do. But back to our binding. So I did used to do my binding by hand, but honestly, I just don't have the time to devote to doing that much handwork with the rate that I'm making quilts. And to be honest, I'm just not that patient either. So I was determined to come up with a system that I felt had a professional looking binding that was equal to that of the hand binding. And through trial and error, I finally found a system that works for me. And that's what I was going to share with you today. And so the tools that I use, and I'll just go over all the tools and then we'll be using them throughout the process. But of course, I've already have my binding pre-made. I usually make my binding when I'm adding borders, when I'm still cutting all of the pieces at the end of the quilt making process. That's normally when I go ahead and make and prepare my binding, and I coil it up and just put a pin in it, nothing fancy. Set it aside until I'm ready to use it. So that's ready to go. And then the other tools that I would use would be, first of all, the feet that I'm going to use when I actually sew it on. So my machine uses what's called AccuFeed. It's a Janome 8200 QCP. And those machines have basically you don't need a walking foot because it has what they call AccuFeed built into it, which is amazing. But with my AccuFeed system, it included several feet. So I use my 1/4 inch foot with the guide bar. That's the one I use for all my piecing. Well, I use that same one when I apply the binding. So that's what I'll be using first. The other foot that I use in the process is my stitch in the ditch. And that also just has a guide in the center to help you stay on the seam. So typically that's what I'm using it for, is when I'm sewing directly over a seam or right alongside a seam. And we're essentially going to be doing that for this as well. So when I sew the binding initially, I'm sewing it on the front just like you would if you were hand binding, and that's with my 1/4 inch. Then I come back at the end of the process when I'm ready to sew the other side of the binding. I'm actually then sewing it from the back to the front, and that's when I used my stitch in the ditch. And we'll talk more about how I get to that point next. When I initially apply the binding in the beginning, I use 2 different rulers to help me with the ending part. So you end with basically the tails on either end, and so there's 2 rulers that I really, just any ruler that's going to basically where you can mark your 2.5 inches, or if you're not using a 2.5 inch binding, you'd be cutting it down to whatever the width of your binding is. So this is the one I just usually grab. It's my 2.5 by 4.5. I just love this ruler. It's my Creative Grids, and it's just my handy one. It's probably one of the rulers I use the most. And then the other one is the Mini Simple Folded Corners ruler by Doug Lico. I've mentioned this one multiple times because I love this ruler. It's become one of my most essential tools. I use it constantly, and I've determined that for binding, it's perfect for that ending that you need for your binding. I just use this to trim it out, and it does great every time. I'll be demonstrating how I use all of these throughout, but I just wanted to go ahead and give you a list of the tools first. And then the last thing, and this is the other secret sauce of my process, is the 505 glue stick. Now you could use also Elmer's washable glue. It does just the same. We'll use this when we're pressing our binding. After sewing it initially, we press it and then wrap it around, and that's when I glue it on. So now that we've reviewed all of the tools that we'll need during the process, let's get started. All right, I am set up at my sewing machine. I've got my binding here, and I've got the quilt just ready to go. A couple things I wanted to mention. So when I begin, I'm actually going to leave a tail. I start on one of the sides, and usually halfway down is kind of my goal, and typically it's going to be on the right side. So I'm going to leave this tail. All right, and so that's kind of lets plenty of room. I usually just drop my binding back here, and I just pull it as I go. All right, and then the other thing I was going to mention is when we trimmed, remember before we actually trimmed it, I had marked it because I like to include a 1/4 inch of batting all around just to give the batting a more full feel. When I'm sewing, I'm not actually doing it against the batting. I'm doing it a 1/4 inch away, and I have that line to let me know where that mark is. All right, and I do my seam length is a little bit longer. I went with a 2.4 because it doesn't, since you're going through 3 layers, it doesn't need to be too tight. All right, I'm just adjusting my quilt because I'm going to be moving it around a lot. All right, I think we are ready. I've already got it set for a 1/4 inch, so we are ready to go. I am going to back stitch here to reinforce that start. I just keep adjusting the whole process. Again, this is being applied to the front of my quilt, just as if you're going to do hand binding. As I'm approaching the end, I usually grab a needle and I make sure I mark a 1/4 inch from the end. Go ahead and mark that. My pin is in, I leave my needle in the down position, raise my presser foot, pivot, and I'm pivoting because I want this to go right in that very corner, right off the edge, because this is what's going to help make those beautiful mitered corners. All right. So you can see right here, basically it's just, once I got to that point, I just did a 90-degree miter right there. Now I go ahead and just pull the next side of the quilt around. And then I'm going to pull the binding back. You can see it makes a nice little 90-degree, looks perfect right there. Then you just fold it back on itself. Again, keeping that nice straight line right in line with my marking. And that process is what's going to make your mitered corners look as professional as they need to be. All right, and now we just do the same process all along this side. I'm approaching the end again, so I'm going to do the same process here where I go ahead and mark a 1/4 inch away. Pull my pin out, raise my lever pivot, and go off at that 90 degrees. Pull the next section, the next side around. Fold it back. On itself to create that 90-degree and continue. At this point, we're rounding our last corner and then coming around to the end where we'll show the finishing. So we'll go ahead and do this last corner together. Like before, I come up to the pin and I have my needle in the down position. I can pull my pin now, lift my presser foot, pivot to the corner, right, and now I go ahead and adjust my quilt. Now I can see when I come to this side, here's my ending. There's my tail right there. So really I want to stop sewing probably about right here. I want to leave plenty of space to finish off the binding together. So I put that pin in to mark where I'm going to end. Now we'll go ahead and do the same process. Once I get to that pin, I'm going to stop, pull that out, and I'm going to backspace. Okay, we are done applying the binding to the front with the exception of our ending. So let me get this over to the cutting table to do the next step. Okay, we are set up with all the tools that we are going to need. So again, I have my rotary cutter, my basically a 2.5 inch wide ruler, more or less depending on the width of your binding. The mini simple folded corners ruler. I have several pens here, and then my scissors. All right, so I'm going to go ahead first, and this is where I did my beginning, and I'm going to go ahead, I'm actually going to go ahead and trim off because that still has the selvage. So let me go ahead and trim a little bit of that off. And then I'm going to go ahead and I like to just pin it down right at the end to this kind of keeps it taut. And it also lets me know where that pin is because that's going to be my guide. Then I come to the other side, the ending binding, and I'm going to go ahead and just kind of press it down. I'm not pulling it, but I just want it taut, but not pulled. Once I hit the pin, then I know I'm going to go 2.5 inches past the pin before I cut it. But I don't want to cut through this other one. I just want to cut through this. So this is extra binding here that you can add to your stash for either another project or scrappy border for later. All right, now that I've cut it the 2.5 inches past, I'm going to go ahead and remove my pins. Now I'm going to go ahead and apply this just like I was making border strip where I'm seaming 2 sections together. So I'm going to basically put the ending binding down first, right side up. Then I take my beginning piece of binding, open it up, put it right side down. So basically your right sides are facing. And I want to just get this completely squared up evenly. Looks perfect. You could pin if you want. I usually don't. I just get it right where I need it and I just hold it there. And I can see that it's staying. Put my mini simple folded corners ruler right there at that. There's my line right here. There's my line right there. So I know it's right where it needs to be. And trim. I'm still holding this. And I just slide this down and apply my pins. All right. That's how easy it was. Now I'm going to go get this sewn. This is why you want to make sure that you leave plenty of room for your tails so it's easy to get your tails through the machine. Otherwise, you're just having to pull it closer, and I've certainly dealt with that. But with a little practice, you learn about the right length to leave it. All right, so I can go and remove this first pin. I'm ready to sew. All right, I don't normally take it to my machine and press it. I just press it at this point with my fingers, press it open really good. All right, once it's pressed open and I feel like it's gonna stay, and you could use your little roller to press it too. Now we're just ready to go apply it. We've closed that and we just need to get this sewn down. I'm gonna start where I left off. Can kind of test it, make sure the length is right, and it is. All right, we are done applying our binding. The next step in this process, I'm going to take it to the iron, and I use my larger ironing board for this. And so I'm going to take it into the other room and start pressing this down really good. And so I'll show you that process. Make sure that your binding is stitched down securely. And then once I get all of that done, I also like, say, here's a string. I'll be trimming all my little strings as I press this. And then once I get that done, the next step after we do that is to wrap it around. And that's where I'm going to be gluing all of this, a little bit of that glue stick, and I press it down right past that seam line right there. That's what I'm looking at, just literally past that where it's covering the seam. And when you glue that down at that point and you do that carefully, then the next step when we come back to this machine, we'll already have this secured down with the glue, and we'll be coming back and stitching in the ditch right here on this line to do a nice finished look. You won't even hardly see this line. All you'll see is on the back, you'll see a nice finished seam on the back. Let's go get this finished. Next step is we're just going to start pressing this down, and I do like to have my scissors handy because I will be using them to cut strings. And I just go ahead and make sure I pull this. Again, I'm not pulling it hard. I just want to make sure it's fully open. Don't want any chance of it folded under. My iron is nice and hot. Really want to make sure I go in that corner good. I'm going to go ahead and finish getting this ironed on the front. Okay, it's time for the secret sauce of the process, and that's where the 505 temporary adhesive glue stick comes in. So I've got the front of my binding completely pressed, so now it's opened out and just ready for the next step. So I go ahead and just start. I usually start right here on this side, and then that way I get that first corner done, and then I just keep going from there. And I just apply a layer, and you can see it goes on blue, which is a little terrifying, but it goes away very quickly. That blue does disappear. Go ahead and apply it on the entire surface that's visible. And that way I know it's just ready for me to go ahead and press it on. Right, that's as far as I can get. I'm going to set that aside. I come over here and I pull this just past my seam line. When you iron it down, it's going to stay. Look at that. Isn't that amazing? What a great job it does. That, like I said, has been the game changer for me. And so now when I take that to the machine, of course I'll be looking at this side, and look at that. It's a beautiful binding. I'm going to stitch right in that ditch so you won't see it from the front. And if you've put this glue on correctly, just past that seam, it's going to be a nice even seam line all the way around. So each step of the process is important as far as making sure you line things up. And like I said, this is the important step to make sure that your back seam comes out looking good. But it's really just that simple. Ready to apply some more glue. Again, as I'm pressing, I literally just let it, with my finger, I'm pressing it just past that seam. Because I know that's the critical step to having a nice seam on the back. when I sew it down. I'm doing this corner here, so again, I press it down really good. Before I go any further, I need to put a little bit more glue now, right here where I folded that corner over. Again, another pretty miter. I'm going to finish out gluing this corner. And again, as far as I can, down this side. I'm going to glue in the corner again. All right, I'm almost to the end. I just need to apply this. All corners are done. Just finishing up this last little section. Okay, it's done. So next step, washing my hands and then heading back over to the sewing machine for the last step. Okay, a couple things before we actually start. I did go ahead and change my thread to one that's going to go for both the top and the bottom. I want to make sure my thread sort of matches my binding. I don't want that. I want to make this as invisible as possible at this stage. So I've already done that. I've also switched my foot. Like I said, I'm using the Stitch in the Ditch foot for this. So again, my machine, I'm able to just switch those feet out pretty easily with AccuFeed. So that's done. The other thing, I make sure I don't want a 1/4 inch. I want to have it centered this time. So I've done that. And then my stitch length, I've got it 2.4, and I'll go ahead and leave that. I usually start in the corner, right there on the miter. But again, I'm kind of in the corner of it. All right, so the goal is to keep this Stitch in the Ditch guide bar. I want to keep that right alongside as we go. So number one, it's not visible on the front, and number two, it seams it right where it should on the back, which is just on the other side of this seam, just so it'll leave a little bit of space. All right, we are ready. I do back space here. Okay, we're looking good. Again, I like to do things fast, but I have found fast is not your friend with this step. Fast compared to hand sewing, yes. Fast compared to sewing, no. Because otherwise, if it doesn't line up right, I'm wanting to rip it out. And that certainly doesn't save any time. It just adds to frustration. When we come up to a corner like this, slow down a little bit. Get right, go ahead and leave my needle down. Adjust my quilt so it's ready for the whole next side. visually take a peek. Good. All right, I'm not going to keep the video recording for this, but basically I'm going to continue this same process on all sides, and let's take a look at how it's looking. So if you can see, look at that, you can't even see the thread on the front. Isn't that amazing? And then I turn it over to the back and look, a perfect stitch down. So I am so pleased with this process. And like I said, I went through a lot of trial and error before I reached this point. So I don't like to go back and look at my old quilts. The binding is pretty horrendous. But like I said, I always say quilting is a journey. We don't begin knowing how to do everything. We figure it out through trial and error, and we get better with each project. So that's the goal. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording, and we'll take a final look once I finish this process. Okay, let's take a final look at our binding. And I went on ahead and tried to focus an area right here in the corner. Look at that. Isn't that amazing? That is stitched down on the front, and you don't even see it because we use that stitch in the ditch. Let's see if I can show a little closer. Look how amazing that looks. And then when you turn it around, look at that. Even in the corner, mitered corner. Isn't that amazing? So like I said, it did take me trial and error to get to this point with it. I had some pretty wonky looking lines, but that's where I've just learned when I do the gluing on this part. That's why I just go right past that seam. And if I do that carefully and I stitch in the ditch carefully, then I know it's gonna line up nicely and make a really pretty binding. So again, I don't go fast through this process, but it's a whole lot faster than if I was trying to do this all by hand. And honestly, I think my machine binding actually looks better than my hand binding. And certainly, like I said, I'm just not that patient. I'm always eager to get to the next project. So I don't think I think I'd lose some of my enthusiasm for quilting if I had to hand bind all of these. So definitely this works for me. So certainly hand binding is probably still the ideal, but this is a nice alternative for those who would prefer to machine bind. One of the Scrappy quilts that I've been working on recently has been the churn dash. And so that started as our half square triangles. And from there, I ended up making churn dash blocks. And then once I had enough churn dash blocks, I decided to make the Irish chain block in between to give it this final look. So literally this started out with just some scraps of half square triangles and turned into what I thought was going to be a queen, but it kept growing, and it's officially a king size quilt. So it's a little bit big for this display wall, but I wanted to have it where you can really see the whole full effect of the quilt. So after I finished the body of it, then I ended up bordering it out both with just a small 1-inch border, inner border, and that's some of Camille's, I believe that's Camille's Rosemary Cottage collection. And then finally that final border, just that plaid, I felt like that kind of just finished it off and kind of completed that look. And then I had the perfect back. It was 108-inch wide that I just happened to have just waiting, I think, for this specific project. Now, since this was big enough for a bed for sure, I definitely wanted to complete the look with pillow shams. I made 2 of these king-size pillow shams, and they just carry over the look. So we start out with our squares and then finished it off with, again, some more of that plaid border. And then the back is just this beautiful Nantucket blue for the back of our pillow shams. So there's 2 of these, and these pillow shams are large enough for even your thickest pillow. It's definitely a fun project just to showcase exactly what you can do with nothing but some scraps. Now, as much as I'd love to keep this quilt, I know this quilt is meant for another home. And that's why I've officially opened a Quilts Bloom at Dawn Etsy shop. And this quilt will be available, if you're interested in it, it will be available for sale on our Etsy shop. And I'll include a link in the description if this is something you'd be interested in for yourself or someone else. That link will be there in case you're interested, and this will come with both the quilt and the 2 pillow shams. As far as the quilting, when I have a quilt this large, I definitely prefer to use my walking foot, and so I went on ahead and used one of my all-time favorites, which is just a horizontal line, 1 inch apart, echoed all across the quilt. I just really like that look, and because this is 100 by 100 inch, if you prefer, you could just flip it and it could be either vertical lines or horizontal, whatever your preference. But this is just a classic look, and it's my go-to for a lot of my really large quilts. It's definitely doing horizontal, vertical, or diagonal lines, whether it's a 1/2 inch or 1 inch apart. That's just one of my favorite go-to. I just love the symmetry of that. Another item that you'll find available on our new Etsy shop, Quilts Bloom at Dawn, is the table runner that we just made using our Nantucket collection along with the Shoreline collection. So I'll have 2 of these that will be available, and it's 5 of these blocks long. These table runners measure about 15.5 inches across by about 54.5 inches long. So perfect size for just about any table. One more item that we'll have available on our Etsy shop is our table topper. Along with this beautiful large table topper, we'll have one of our medium-sized hot pads. If you're interested in one of the table runners, in the table topper with the hot pad set, or that king-size quilt featuring our churn dash and Irish chain block, if you're interested in any of those items, those will all be linked in the description, and it'll be a link to our Etsy shop, Quilts Bloom at Dawn. In addition, we have several other quilts that are also available for you to check out. Our second Scrappy project that I've been working on is officially titled our Bluebird Crossing. Now this project began with the leftovers from our trip around the island. I had 4 extra strips, and those strips turned into these 9 patches. Once I had the 9 patches, I went on ahead and put them on point. And then once I put those on point, as I was trying to think of what other block I could include on this quilt, I have wanted a Bluebird quilt for the longest time. So this was the perfect project for that. So that's how this one came to be. Literally just 4 extra strips from our trip around the island. Now I did happen to have a few more extra strips from when I did the Bargello from Laundry Basket. So I was able to use those as well. And so that gave me enough to make this project. Now this is a much smaller quilt. It's more of a large throw size, but definitely the perfect size for like a living room couch. Now, as far as the quilting on this one, this is one of my all-time favorite free motion designs. You'll see me use this one a lot, and that is nothing but swirls. And what's great about the swirls is once you get started making them, again, on a machine like this, you don't even have to worry about whether they're big ones or they're little ones. They can be a little bit wonky, and when you look at it from a distance, it just has that overall beautiful swirl design effect. I know that if you have a long arm, you're gonna have a much more professional look, but for those that aren't ready to invest in something that large of an item and that costly of an item, you can do the quilting on your machine, your sewing machine at home, and still have a beautiful quilt. Now, as far as the backing, Laundry Basket had the most beautiful fabric from their Sewing Bird collection. So I went on ahead and used this fabric for this project. I had just enough to make it. And the final quilt, and this is the quilt that started off this series, was our trip around the island. Completely finished. Our quilting is done. Our binding is done. This project is officially complete. So let's take a look. This came together. If you've been following along, maybe you've been quilting along with me, we've started off with just those strips. We put those together in 4 sections. And then we finally sewed those 4 sections together, added our beautiful border here, and then quilted this. And this was another perfect opportunity to use our walking foot with, on the diagonal, and they were 1/2-inch lines echoed across the entire quilt. And look at what a beautiful design that made. And that was an intentional choice to not pull away from the design of the quilt itself. I just love the way that all the squares come together to create this look. And I felt like the walking foot on the diagonal would be the perfect way to accent that. As far as our binding, of course, that's the last step we just did. This machine binding that you cannot even tell when you look at it from the front, you would never even know that this has been machine bound. And then if you turn it over on the back, again, that seam is just so tight that, again, you'd have to do a double take to even know that this was done on machine and not hand bound. Taking the time to do those extra steps of pressing it really good from the front and then using that glue stick to, again, pull that binding right past the seam and then again to press that down. Those extra steps just really added to the overall effect of this binding to give this finished look. So this completes all 3 of our quilts, our trip around the island and then both of our Scrappy projects that we've been working on. And now it is time to shift our attention to our Nantucket collection. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I hope you stay tuned for our next video, which will be airing either Wednesday or Thursday of this week. This week's video will focus on a couple areas. We'll take a look at the progress that I've made on my blocks of the month. And then I'm so excited, we're officially starting our first Nantucket summer full-size quilt. There are actually 3 quilts that I'm planning to make in the near future with the Nantucket Summer Collection. The first is the Hearth and Home quilt by Laurie Holt, and that's from her Prairie Home book. The second is from Celebrate with Quilts, and it's the Blue Willow quilt. And the third is Galway Bay from Missouri Star. And if you want to know more information about each of those, check out a previous video that I did on our Nantucket Summer Collection. Those were the 3 projects that I had mentioned that we would hopefully be targeting, and we are finally ready to get started. This week, we'll be focused specifically on selecting our fabrics and then cutting for our Hearth and Home quilt. Now, of all the projects, I have to say this one is probably the easiest. It's 2.5-inch strips mostly and just some squares other than our sawtooth star centers. So this is going to actually come together pretty quickly. If you'd like to join us on this project, I encourage you to go ahead and, if you don't already have the Prairie Home book, grab that book and I'll include a link to it if you're interested in purchasing that. And we'll get started with that with our midweek video next week. On Saturday, stay tuned because we'll be making a block and watching the quilt come together. Like I said, this one really will come together pretty quickly, so I encourage you to join us. If you're enjoying these videos, I encourage you to give us a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. We also have our Quilts Bloom at Dawn Facebook page, and I encourage you to check us out. Until next time, happy quilting!